Today we're going to be learning Sukkah Daf Lamed Aleph, famous story in today's daf, so stay tuned. Famous story with women. We're going to start at the beginning of our daf with Tanu Rabbanan. Sukkah Gzula B'Misakech B'Reshut HaRabim. So now what's the story with a stolen sukkah? We did make reference to this somewhat on daf Tet. We're now going to discuss it again. Now that we just talked about a lulav gazul, a stolen lulav, now we're going to talk about a sukkah gzula. Is it the same law? So a sukkah gzula, v'hamisakech b'reshut harabim, one who puts up schach in reshut harabim, meaning you take, we're going to have to see in a minute what exactly is a sukkah gzula. But setting up schach in reshut harabim basically means I take over public space and I say, this is mine, I'm building my sukkah here. So to speak, stolen. Rabbi Eliezer posel v'chachamim machshirim. Rabbi Eliezer, who we saw with all sorts of interesting shitot about Chag Sukkot on Daf Kaf Zayin, he also forbids this kind of a sukkah. Okay, now remember, according to him, you have to have your own sukkah. And it has to be, remember, he says, Lecha mishelcha. It has to be your own, and you have to sit only in your own sukkah. You can't sit in anyone else's sukkah. But we didn't discuss this as much then, but he's got a very formalistic approach to things, right? Again, Rabbi Ben Horknus was mostly held by Beit Shammai's opinions, even though his teacher was Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, he was a student of Hillel. He viewed halacha as very formalistic. So again, right, it has to fit into this framework. Taseh lecha, it's your own, it has to be yours. You can't take over someone else's, you can't steal it. The chachamim machshirim. Now, surprisingly, you would think, what happened to mitzvah haba ba'avera? Isn't this a mitzvah haba ba'avera? But it seems it's not. Okay, so we'll talk about this soon. Why exactly is this not considered a mitzvah haba ba'avera? So Amar Rav Nachman, machloket b'shetokefet chavero v'hotzio misukkato. Rav Nachman's now going to say, hold off. The debate is not, it depends what you mean exactly by a sukkah gzula. They debate if somebody assaults someone, kicks them out of their sukkah and takes over their sukkah, that's what we call a sukkah gzula. In that case, Rabbi Eliezer l'tamei, he goes according to his own approach. Da'amal, as we said before, you can't use someone else's sukkah, and here you're using someone else's sukkah. Now, it's a little bit different than sitting in your friend's sukkah when they invited you, but it's really part of the same problem, he says. And now we're going to just say, it really a little bit depends on this machloket, or it doesn't really, we're going to see, no matter how you look at the machloket, about whether or not karka is nigzelet or not. If you remember, we said in yesterday's daf that there's a machloket about whether or not karka is nigzelet, which means if I steal your land, is it considered my own or not? So he said, the Gemara says it doesn't really matter. I karka nigzelet, if you say land could be stolen and it could be considered in my name, then sukkah gzulai. Well, then it's still a problem because it's stolen. And what did we learn on Daf Tet? That it has to be lecha mishalcha and not gzula and not she'ula. Okay, gzula and she'ula fall into the same category. It's not the sense that lecha means make for yourself and don't steal it. It means really you have to do something on your own and you can't steal it and you can't borrow it. There's an importance in fulfilling the mitzvah of actually, it almost sounds like he's saying you have to build your own sukkah. That's the important part. Make it your own, not steal someone else's. So therefore, he says, if you hold the karka nigzelet, then it's a sukkah gzula, and that's forbidden because it's sukkah gzula. V'inami karka ena nigzelet, and if you think karka can't be stolen, which means it's still considered in the name of your owner, well, then obviously sukkah she'ulai. Then, now it's not really a borrowed sukkah, but it's no better than a borrowed sukkah. Now, a borrowed sukkah is a problem. Of course, if you take it and it has someone else's name on it, of course, it's going to be a problem. Now, I just want to point out one important thing about this machloket, whether you say karka gzula or karka ena gzula, Rabbi Eliezer himself is the one who holds karka nigzelet, that it is able to be stolen. And therefore, it's a little bit strange that the Gemara brings both options here, whether you hold karka nigzelet or whether he holds karka ena nigzelet, because we're within Rabbi Eliezer, and he himself is the one who holds the karka nigzelet. So if you look at Tosfot, he addresses this. He says, I karka nigzelet, and he says, emetu de Rabbi Eliezer savarkin. The truth is, Rabbi Eliezer is the one who actually holds karka nigzelet. That's what appears in Bava Kama. But what the Gemara is trying to do is to say, either which way you look at it, it'll be a problem, even though even though that's really not Rabbi Eliezer himself's opinion. Okay. There are those who say that, by the way, this isn't all Rav Nachman speaking. The Rav Nachman's really only saying the words. Okay, I read this in an article I'm going to quote later about the story. Moshe Simon Shoshan wrote an article, Talmud is a Novel, and there's a longer title to it about also stories including women in the Talmud, but the article is called Talmud as a Novel, and he claims that this part in the middle about Rabbi Eliezer, L'Ta'ameh, and then the rabbis and their reasoning is all the Stam Gemara, and it's not actually Rav Nachman speaking. Rav Nachman is the one who just said, Machloka b'shtukev v'chavirav Yomi Sukkato, and then we'll continue with Rav Nachman's words in a minute. Either which way, okay, I'm not going to get into what the importance is if it's Stam, the Stam is really the narrator, and it's usually a later source, okay? Usually from the time post-Amoratic time period that kind of got into the Gemara. In any case, and that would explain a little bit why they're going through all the different options, even though that's clearly not Rabbi Eliezer's opinion. Okay, now, so again, the machloket is if you kick someone out of their sukkah. Rabbi Eliezer holds you can't fulfill your mitzvah in someone else's sukkah, whether you own this now because you stole it, if we say karka and exelet, and then it's still a stolen sukkah and it's not a fulfillment of lecha. Make yourself a sukkah and don't steal it and don't borrow it. Or karka and an exelet, and then for sure it's not your own. And of course you can't be yotze. You can't fulfill your obligation. Rabbanan l'ta'amayu da'amre adam yotze yidei chovato b'sukkato shel chavero. Rabbanan say you can't fulfill your mitzvah in someone else's sukkah, and they hold v'karka and an exelet, that you can't steal land. So basically, we're going to view this v'sukkah she'ulahi, and therefore we're going to view this as if it's a borrowed sukkah, because you can't really steal land. Now, in this case, karka and an exelet, okay, again, you're going to have to ask, even if karka and an exelet, you've still stolen something, right? Now, technically speaking, it's not considered your own, right? Now, and therefore, it's the way the rabbis view it is, well, it's as if it's like borrowed. Now, obviously, it's not borrowed because you tried to steal it. But the main point is that you're in someone else's sukkah, and for whatever reason, and we're going to have to ask what's the reason for this, they don't seem to think it's an issue of mitzvah haba ba'aveira, right? You stole it. It's not yours, and now you're sitting in it. Even if, technically speaking, this is not considered yours, it doesn't transfer ownership to you. You're sitting in a stolen sukkah. So the Mefarshim try to grapple with this. Why is this not mitzvah ba'avera? So if you remember, we talked about Soloveitchik, and it really is based on something that the Ritva quotes, which is that the mitzvah ba'avera is only relevant in things that have to do with ritzui HaKadosh Baruch Hu, appeasement, things like sacrifices and the lulav and the shaking the lulav, but not sukkah. It doesn't fall into the category of mitzvah ba'avera. That's one option. Another is to say that the Meiri suggests that maybe mitzvah ba'avera is permitted, okay, and that maybe this sugya holds that. It's difficult logic to say that, but possibly there's a way to go that way. Another option is to say that there's shinoi maaseh and shinoi shem. You've stolen something from someone else. You've done something to it. Actually, no, that's more later. Sorry, we're going to get to that later. My mistake. Hold off on that for right now. Right. 1 second. Now that's going to be more connected to the story later. This is different because this you're actually stealing your friend's sukkah. So there's no shinoi shem and there's no shinoi maaseh. So in any case, the other option, by the way, it's really there's two options. Either to say ignore what I said about the Meiri before. Either to say there's no mitzvah ba'avera by sukkah at all, okay, because it's not ritzui. Or maybe to say that maybe part of what is bothering Rabbi Eliezer really is mitzvah ba'avera, and the rabbis disagree about it. Okay, but again, it's difficult. It's not really a great answer. Okay. Now we're moving on in Rav Nachman. So Rav Nachman had said that the machloket, and when you say the machloket is only in this case, you're now going to say, and it's not in a different case. Aval gazal etzim, but if you stole wood, v'sikech bahem, and then you used it as schach, so you stole the raw ingredients. Divrei hakol eno ela demei etzim. Everyone agrees that you don't have to actually return the wood, and the wood becomes yours, and you can use it in your sukkah. There's no issue of mitzvah ba'avera. We're going to have to see why. And then all you have to do is return the value of the money. Mimai, how do we get this? How do we know? Now, what we really want to know, how do we know that the machloket is when you attack someone and kick them out of their sukkah? Midikatane dumia de reshut harabim. Because look at the two cases. They gave the cases of tokev et chavero and hotzio misukkato. You attack someone and kick them out of their sukkah, and hamasakech bereshut harabim, one who takes over the public domain and puts up schach. Now, they have to be, because they put them together, we saw this just the other day, when you juxtapose two things, it's because their laws must be similar. Ma reshut harabim karka lav didehu, sukanami lav karka didehu. Just like reshut harabim, the land is not his own. Likewise, it must be a case where the land is not your own and you're actually stealing the land and not the raw materials. And that's how they get this. So now, on the backdrop of the fact that Rav Nachman says that everyone agrees, okay, and even though it still be chachamim in any case, but everyone agrees that if you steal the wood and you use it in your sukkah, it's not a problem to fulfill your mitzvah. So that leads us to the following story. Hahu Safta, there was a grandmother, okay, an elderly woman is maybe another way to say it. To Atay l'kamei Rav Nachman, she comes before Rav Nachman. Background about Rav Nachman, if you recall, we've seen him a bunch of times. He often is found with the Reish Galuta, the exilarch, who was a very wealthy, prominent person, often knowledgeable also. Rav Nachman was kind of his rabbi often. He was married to Yalta, the daughter of the Reish Galuta, and he's very much found often in his midst. And he's wealthy. Okay, this is very important for the backdrop of this story. So this elderly woman comes before Rav Nachman. Amrele, she says to him, Reish Galuta, v'kulu Rabbanan debe Reish Galuta, the exilarch, and all the rabbis of the house of the exilarch the exilarch was the head of the galut, of the exile. Okay, that was his name. He was the person in charge. They're all Sukkah, gzula havayatve. They're all sitting in a stolen sukkah. Now, it's not clear at this point in the story whether it was her stolen sukkah, whether they stole from her, or she was kind of pleading on behalf of someone else. Okay, Rashi actually points out that it was her sukkah. Okay, Rashi says, Rashi tells us it was actually her sukkah, okay, her wood that they stole. And she basically comes and claims, which is this crazy story, this elderly woman, the rabbis and the Reish Galuta, they came and they stole wood from her and built their sukkah with it. Very hard to understand because he's so wealthy, right? How could that possibly be? But seems like, she's probably right. And now what happens? First, Amrele, she says to him, now you see, there's no reaction, okay? So tzavcha velo eshkachba. She screams velo eshkachba Rav Nachman, and Rav Nachman ignores her. Okay, now this is a very interesting story, right? You have this scene, the woman screaming, "You stole my wood! There's my wood! This is my sukkah!" And Rav Nachman just doesn't say anything. Amrele, she says to him, great line. Itita da havalela avua tlat mea betim nesrei avde savcha kamaihu velo eshkachitu ba. A woman whose father had 380 servants, meaning you think I'm this poor woman and you're ignoring me, but my father was super wealthy. Okay, who is she referring to? Avraham Avinu. Avraham Avinu had 380 servants, and she says the woman whose father was very wealthy is screaming before you and you're ignoring her. In other words, I'm a Jew just like you. You think you're in this higher echelon of society and you can just ignore someone like me? No can do. Amar lehu Rav Nachman. So what does he say to her? He actually doesn't say to her. Amar lehu. He says to them. You can imagine the scene. She's screaming, making a whole scene, and he ignores her entirely. Now at least he starts explaining himself to the people he's with. He says to them, Amar lehu pi'itahida. This is just a screamer, crazy woman. Ve'ena eled me'etzim bilvad. She has absolutely no claim. All she can do is get back the value of the wood itself. We don't have to take apart the sukkah because all we have to do is return the value of the sukkah of the wood that we stole. That's it. Okay. Now, that's the end of the story. Crazy story. What's going on here? Okay, so part of what I'm going to say is based on some things that I read in this article of Moshe Simon Shoshan, who's a professor in Bar Ilan. What he tries to show very interesting theory that the Talmud is like a novel. And a novel, he talks about this theory of novels, that you can tell a story, one story, from many different perspectives. And what he tries to show is that there's three perspectives here almost. There's Rav Nachman, there's the Stam, the narrator, and there's the woman. And each perspective of the story is kind of getting at something, and there's a pull in all different directions. And he builds this model, which is very beautiful, which is this idea of, on the one hand, you have the rabbi and with the formalistic halacha. So listen, this is the halacha. The halacha is you're not deserving of anything other than the value of your wood, but there's no problem that they're sitting in your sukkah because it's not a halachic issue. Right now, why? Okay, that's one. We'll get back to why this isn't, again, mitzvah ba'avera. She's claiming, right, she comes not necessarily on halachic ground, but she comes on moral ground. She says, listen, this is a moral, ethical issue. I'm this elderly woman. You guys are the wealthy. You're stealing from the poor. It almost sounds like the end of the second parak where we're talking about the poor oppressing the rich oppressing the poor. And that, what are you doing here? I'm this poor woman. You stole my wood and you're using it for your sukkah. This is morally inappropriate. And there's this other voice of critique. And we see this many times in the Gemara where the rabbis criticize themselves. And how are they bringing it? Through a different voice, right? They use, and this is one of the things it claims in the article, that in order to get criticism, we have to often use a different voice, like the voice of women, which is very rarely heard in the Gemara. And there's a number of stories that fit this genre. We're going to get to them in Gittin. There's a very famous one where the woman basically goes to court and she gets put in a bind where they basically give her almost nothing. And she curses the rabbi because she has no other means of what to do. There's another woman in Bava Kama in a similar story where she tries to, Bava Batra, where she tries to claim rights to land. And then they say, well, you didn't do it right halachically, so it's not yours. And there's all these cases of women. It's very interesting, of women who get stuck in these situations where they don't have a legal claim, but they have a moral claim that there's something wrong going on here. And what he's claiming is that there's a tension here between formal halacha sometimes and what's morally right. And sometimes there's a clash and they don't always fit together. And here they're showing, and they're criticizing, number one, the rabbis and the formalistic approach. And number two, the wealthy who are oppressing the poor, right? She comes and she brings her own source. Right now, it's not interesting. It's not a Gemara source, but it's not a halachic source, but it's a Torah source. She says, look, I'm just like you. I'm no different. I also had the same father as you. I also came from wealth, and don't look at me as any different than you. And then there's, perhaps he adds in the narrator's perspective, I'm not going to get into that also, but that there's tensions going on here. Perhaps the narrator is kind of, on the one hand, the narrator often sides with the male socioeconomic, higher echelon of society claim, right? But also sensitive to the fact that there's this woman here. Again, I don't want to get into so much into the stam, but really the idea being that there's different things in conflict here. And it's showing them in a very obvious way, because you can't read this story and not think something's wrong with the rabbis here, right? How is he totally ignoring her? He doesn't ever address her. And why is she? Now, one of the reasons, some of the Mepharshim say, why wasn't he addressing her? Because she was screaming, right? Now, I don't buy that, because she first spoke to him, he ignored her, and then she screamed. And I think that sometimes you see the women in the Talmud often scream. And the reason is, we'll see a bunch of stories of women that scream, and there's some woman whose husband died and she goes screaming in the streets. What did he do wrong? And then he was such a tzaddik. And sometimes you see their struggle, right? They have no voice. And in order to get their voice heard, they have to scream, right? We're so blessed to be in a generation where we don't have to do that anymore. But there were often times in the Gemara where that woman who cursed them, she had nothing left in her arsenal but to curse, right? They left her kind of high and dry. And again, I think bringing this story in the Gemara is showing the rabbis were self-critical of themselves, and they understood that there was something wrong here. So anyway, very fascinating story, a lot to be said. We're going to move on. Amar Ravina. So now in the line of this thing about the Dmei Eitzim, Amar Ravina, we talked about this yesterday. Why Ein La'ela Dmei Eitzim? Because they instituted what's called Takanat HaShavim. It comes up in a mission in Gittin, that the rabbi said, we want to encourage people who stole to repent. And the only way to do that is to allow them just to pay the value, because they might have already used this, and therefore it would be harder for them to return it. So therefore we institute that they only have to replace the value of it. And that's why they didn't need to return this wood. So Ravina says, "Hi kishura de mitalalta." If you use a big beam in a sukkah, de mitalalta de gzula, de mitalalta de gzula. If you use this beam in a sukkah that was stolen, in other words, you stole this beam and used it in your sukkah. Avdele Rabbanan takanta bishum takanat maresh. The rabbis instituted this takana, again, the same takanat maresh is the takana of the beam, which is again that you don't have to return the beam itself, you only have to return the value. So the Gemara says, Pshita, don't we already know that? It's the same thing as Demei Eitzim. What's the difference? So Ma'ishna Me'eitzim, why is it any different than the wood? So they say, Ma'u Detei Me'eitzim Shchiche, Aval Hailo Shchiche Emalo. You might say wood is more common than a big beam. A big beam, it's less likely you're going to steal that. And you might have thought, therefore, maybe the takana doesn't apply to a less likely case. Kamashman, that it applies as well. Now we're going to go back and say, Hani Mile, what we said before is Bigo Shiv'ah. The whole idea that you don't have to return the wood and just the value is only within 7 days. You have to return it because you're no longer using it anymore. It's not like you built your house with it and now it's stuck in your house and you'd have to take, right? The real original takana comes from the fact that if you stole a beam from someone or some piece of wood and you build your house with it and now you have to return it, you're not going to take apart your house, but your sukkah you're going to take apart anyway. So maybe you do need to return it. So after 7 days, they say you do. The ichibro batina, but if you connected it with cement or plaster or something to some other beams, then afilu la'achar shiva nami yad leidam. Then you could still return only the value. Now we're going to move on to a different topic. Tana. Back to our Mishnah. We talked about lulav hayavesh. Okay, from here we started with sukkah lulav gazul. We got into mitzvah ba'avera. We got into I wanted to end with this idea, the different opinions about why these rabbis sitting in the sukkah wasn't a mitzvah ba'avera, and that was what I started quoting before, which is maybe they held that mitzvah ba'avera is mutar. Maybe they didn't think it was a problem. Or like the Ritva who suggests the suggestion that it's only in Ritzoy, and Rav Soloveitchik develops that it's not applicable to sukkah. Or there was shinoi mas and shinoi shem. They took this piece of wood, they put it in a sukkah, and now it's called tzchach. It's not called wood anymore. And the fourth is that it's possible that you could say the mitzvah is in the tzchach. Now, what it's the wood they could have been using for the walls and not the tzchach. And if you say the mitzvah is really in the tzchach, and they were using this as walls, that's not mitzvah ba'avera because the mitzvah is in the tzchach. That's another way to possibly explain why it wasn't considered a mitzvah ba'avera. Okay. So again, it's a big question here where the crossover of mitzvah ba'avera works in together with sukkah. And right, so we had the first sugya was about stealing land to use for the sukkah. And that we basically said it doesn't apply because it's not really karka in an exele, possibly we say, and therefore it's not considered really stolen. And therefore we have other reasons about it, and then Rabbi Eliezer actually is the only one who forbids it for other reasons, for lecha. And then we have this issue of stealing materials for the sukkah. And then we have excuses as to why that's not mitzvah ba'avera. And we even have a story to prove that clearly the rabbis didn't think it was a problem. Now we're moving back to Yavesh, okay, which was the second case in the Mishnah. We're going to see different sources. The Mishnah had said Yavesh is pasula, dried out lulav is disqualified. So now the Gemara says, Tana Yavesh pasul. Rabbi Yehuda machshir. Rabbi Yehuda thinks that Yavesh is okay. A dry lulav is no problem. We're going to deal a lot with Rabbi Yehuda. The first thing we're going to have is Rava. Amar Rava, machloke belulav, de Rabbanan savre makshina lulav le'etrog. Ma etrog bai hadar, af lulav bai hadar. So Rava says the machloket, by the way, is only in lulav, because when it comes to etrog, everyone agrees you need hadar. That's what we're going to see in a minute. But the machloket is by lulav. What's the machloket? It says pre-eitz hadar, which is referring to the etrog. From there, they assume, and we're going to question this assumption later, but that hadar means beautify. You need to have a beautiful fruit. And just like since lulav appears in the verse next to etrog, we're going to assume that what's true for lulav, what's true for etrog is true for lulav. That's the rabbis. So Rabbanan holds you can't have a lulav yavesh because just like etrog, it needs to be beautiful. Also lulav needs to be beautiful. For Rabbi Yehuda savar lo makshina lulav leetrog. Rabbi Yehuda says you don't make this comparison. Etrog, it says hadar, lulav, it doesn't. Only etrog needs. Aval be'etrog, but when it comes to an etrog, divrei kol hadar be'inan. Everyone will agree that etrog needs hadar. That's rough. Later, we're going to question this assumption, and we're going to claim that even Rabbi Yehuda doesn't need etrog to be hadar either. And then we're going to have to explain, well, what does hadar in the pasuk mean then? But for right now, we're going to go with this assumption. Etrog, everyone agrees you need a nice one. When it comes to lulav, it's a machloket. Do we learn it out from etrog or not? So now we're going to question. So according to this, we said that lulav yavesh is okay according to Rabbi Yehuda. Uba lulav, lo by Rabbi Yehuda hadar, but wait a minute. Today, we're going to bring in a lot of Tanaitic sources that are going to seem to contradict the theories that we raised, or the sources. In this case, we said Yavesh kasher, according to Rabbi Yehuda, but now we're going to have a different source that seems to say not. V'hatznan, doesn't it say in a Mishnah, our Mishnah, Rabbi Yehuda omer ya'agdenu milamala. When we said nifritzu alav, when they split in the middle, so Rabbi Yehuda says you have to bind it. Tanakama said you did it. He says you have to bind it. Now, why else would you have to bind it? If not, my time alav mishum debai hadar, because it needs to look nice, right? When your lulav is split, it doesn't look nice at all. So they say, no, it's not for that reason. It's for a different reason. Rabbi Yehuda omer. It says in a braita the reason. Rabbi Yehuda, and it's not because of hadar. And then we have no problem. Rabbi Yehuda omer mishum Rabbi Tarfon kapot marim. Kapot marim is what it says in the verse, which means lulav. Okay, that's where each of the four minim, the four species, has a word or a few words that describes them. Kapot marim is how, right, from dates. Okay, and that's we get it from a date tree. Now, kapot tmarim, they say kafut. V'imaya parud yechaftenu. Kafut, it must be bound. And if it was split, you have to bind it together. You have to put it together. He learns it from a separate reason. It's a drasha from the verse. Okay, that was question number one on his theory. Now, second, on his opinion. For lo by hadar, but wait, there's another source that seemed to indicate that Rabbi Yehuda requires hadar when it comes to a lulav. V'hatznan ein obdim et halulav ela b'mino. You can only bind the lulav, right? We take those rings we make and we bind the lulav together. What do we use? We use the lulav itself. You can only use it from one of ela b'mino with its type. You can't use something else. Divrei Rabbi Yehuda. Now, what would be the reason? My time, alav mishum debai hadal. We want it to match. We want it to look pretty, right? If you take a gold thread and you wrap it around, right, it's going to look weird. It doesn't match, right? It always looks nice. Our lulav is wrapped with its own ring. So they say, lo, that's not the reason. Tahama Rava, because Rava says, afilu b'siv, afilu b'ikara dedikla. You can even use the fibers of the palm tree, which don't look anything like the lulav itself, or the root of the tree, or something also having to do maybe the outer layers of the tree, which are different color and look totally different. And therefore, it's not because it has to match, right? Like you match your shoes to your dress or your hat to your hip. Not because it has to match. So what's his reason then? Hatam, in this case, right, this case here, it's because he holds the lulav needs to be bound. Again, we're going to get back to this machloket more in depth soon. And if you bring a different type, then actually, is it here? No. Okay. And if you bring a different type, because it has to be bound, then the binding is part of the mitzvah. And if you take something else, you're going to end up with 5 species and not 4. And that's going to be a problem because of what we call baltosi. You're not allowed to add, just like tefillin have 4 sections of the Torah. You can't add a 5th, right? That's adding on. So likewise here, it's adding on to the mitzvah, and that's forbidden. So now they say, okay, so we've resolved. Clearly, he doesn't think you need hadar for lulav. And then what we said already, Rava said the debate was but do we compare it to etrog or not? But clearly everyone holds etrog needs hadar. So now we're going to question that. Uba etrog, mi by Rabbi Yehuda hadar, does he really need hadar? V'hatanya, doesn't it say in a braita, arba'at minim shebelulav, kashem she'em pochatim mehem, kach em mosifim aleh. So the first line, not really connected, but it goes to what we just said a minute ago, which is the 4 species. Since you, just like you can't do less, you can't do 3, you also can't do 5. Okay. Lo matzah etrog. So what if you don't find an etrog? Lo yavi lo parish velo rimon velo davar acher. You can't use a different fruit instead. Okay, not a parish, which I think is a quince, and not a rimon, which is a pomegranate, and not anything else. Kmushin. Now we assume we're talking about the etrog still. If they're shriveled a little, they start to dry up. Shevnim, they're still good. Yiveshim psulim, but if they're dried out, no good. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Af Yeveshin. Rabbi Yehuda says, even dry ones are okay. Here it seems clear, etrog can be dry. It seems to contradict. The Amar Rabbi Yehuda, and he continues to say, Maaseh b'bnei krachim. There was a case in the bnei krachim, in the people outside the cities. Shayu morishim et lulavehem libnei bneihem. Okay, they were living in a place, Rashi says they were living in a place of pardesim, and there were no palm trees. Clearly, they didn't live in Ranana. And they would pass on their lulavim for future generations. Now, it's a little strange here that we were talking all about etrog, right? We started with the 4, then we moved to etrog, and now we're moving back to lulav. But in any case, stick with that for right now. We assumed until now we were all talking about etrog. Now they say they would pass on throughout the generations their lulavim, which means they must have been dry. And that's my proof, right? This is classic Rabbi Yehuda we keep seeing throughout the Masechet. He keeps trying to prove from real life situations, to which Amru lo misham raya, you want to prove it from there? Ein sharet chak raya, they were stuck, they had no choice. That's not a proof for a regular case. You can't prove from there, right? We had a similar case before that it was shat sakana, and they said you can't prove from a shat sakana, right? So anyway, katani mihat, the main point is Rabbi Yehuda Omer, af yeveshim ksherim. My lava, so in my lava etrog, wasn't it referring to an etrog when it said if they shrivel up, they're still good, but if they're totally dried out, they're not good. And then Rabbi Yehuda said they are good. We seem to think they were talking about etrog there. So they say, lo alulav. No, they moved into lulav. Even though they didn't tell you this, he must be talking about lulav, and really etrog would need hadar, according to Rabbi Yehuda. So if we resolve that for right now. Before we move on and really question Rava and his theory, again, Rabbi Yehuda said, right, that lulav hayavesh is kasher, to which Rava said he's only talking about lulav, not etrog. Soon we're going to question that and knock out that whole approach. But at this point, we haven't really knocked it out because this source could be explained that it was talking about lulav and not etrog. Amar Mar. Before we move on, we're going to go a little bit in depth into this thing about okay, just like you can't do any less, you also can't add to them. Pshita, isn't that obvious? So they say, well, Rabbi Yehuda lulav tzarich eged, v'im maite mina acharina, hai lechudekai, v'hai lechudekai kamash malan. You might have thought that since Rabbi Yehuda holds lulav tzarich eged, that means you have the lulav bound together with the hadas and aravot, and then you hold that together with your etrog. If you were to add another one, since it's not bound together, maybe it doesn't look like you're adding on to the mitzvah. Maybe it's clear that this is something different. Kamash malan, therefore comes to teach you, no, you absolutely cannot. Amar Mar, another thing we want to get into in this braita before we get back to our topic. Lo matzah etrog lo yavi lo rimon velo parish velo davar acher. So the Gemara says, pshita, isn't that obvious? We know it's supposed to be a priyat sadar, which we learn by tradition is etrog, right? Would you ever think to bring something other than an etrog? So they say, ma'u detema laite ki echi shelo tishkach torat etrog kamash malan. Imagine you're in a situation one year, you don't have an etrog. So what do? So there's 2 options. Either you don't do anything, or you take something in place of it. Now, imagine you don't take anything and you just take your lulav and your hadasim and aravot. Imagine this happens a bunch of years in a row. You might forget that there's a concept of etrog. So therefore, maybe you would think better to bring some other fruit so that you don't forget the fact that there's etrog. Obviously, the problem with that is, well, then you might forget that you might think that it's a pomegranate and not an etrog. So therefore, right, there's a fine line between how do we remember that there's something there without having it, but yet not cause people to be confused and think that, everything is okay. So therefore, they erred on the side of saying, just don't take it at all. Better that than taking something that will cause you throughout future generations to think that the mitzvah is with a rimon. Okay, so was a very interesting thought process here about maybe you're better off, even though there's no meaning to it and you're not actually fulfilling the mitzvah, maybe you should do something anyway, just so that you don't forget the concept of what it is, right? That there's value. It's almost like, and in the end, they reject this, but it's almost saying maybe there's value to something that's like a mitzvah, even though it's not actually a mitzvah. And this comes up a lot in our lives, right? Where we do something that maybe halachically isn't exactly a mitzvah, but it feels like a mitzvah. And the question is there value to that or is there not? So it's interesting here, right? They'd rather err on the side of not taking anything because they don't want you to get confused and think. Right? One interesting topic that we talked about in Pesachim that's similar to this, where this did happen, is there was the fact that people make kiddush on things that aren't wine. Okay, now that originally was really permitted, certainly in Ashkenazi countries, only when you didn't have any wine. And what happened is over the generations, people didn't have wine anymore. There was no wine in the countries they were living in, and they used liquors and other things instead on Shabbat morning. And that became the commonplace. And there was this big meeting that the Bach talks about, that they had a big meeting in his generation in the 1700s in Poland, where they say, we don't understand why everybody's doing this when it doesn't fit in with the halacha. And this situations do happen in halacha where things change because of certain situations that no longer exist anymore, but because people were doing them for so long, because they were allowed to at that point, because they didn't have wine. But then eventually it became, even when they have wine, people were using it. So it definitely does happen in halacha, the way things develop. It's one of the fascinating things about how halacha develops. And then the question is, how do you respond to that? Should we stop having liquor for Kiddush in the morning because you're really supposed to have wine if you have wine or not? So it also depends what you hold by. But the opinions of the Ashkenazi opinions specifically say the Chamar Medina, things that are other than wine, are only if you have no other wine. Sephardim, like the Rambam talks about, it could be the main thing in your country, even if you also have wine. So it sort of depends who you hold by, but certainly for Ashkenazim, it's much more difficult. Okay, let's move on. Zimnin dinafik up. So I didn't finish the line, but kamash malan zimnin dinafik chorba mine da'ate lemisrach. It's to teach you, no, you can't use anything else because sometimes things will get worse from there. You'll end up thinking that the rimon is the mitzvah. Tashma. Now we're going to bring some sources that question this idea of Rava that Rabbi Yehuda holds that an etrog that's dry is disqualified. Etrog hayashan pasul, an old etrog is disqualified. But Rabbi Yehuda machshir. Rabbi Yehuda says it's totally fine, an old etrog. Now, an old etrog must be dried up. Tiyuvta de Rava tiyuvta. So they basically say, Rava, you're wrong. Rabbi Yehuda clearly didn't need hadar, not for lulav and not even for etrog. So now we're going to have to explain that. So now they say, first of all, before we explain it, we're going to say, but wait, there's all these other sources where Rabbi Yehuda, again, this is the same way we question. What, he doesn't need lulav yavesh? He doesn't disqualify lulav yavesh? What about, doesn't he need hadar and lulav? Didn't we see this? Didn't we see that? And every time we answered it, oh no, that's for a different reason. That's for a different reason. Same thing with etrog. Doesn't it say in the Mishnah, hayarok kikarte, if it's green, the etrog is green, like a leek, Rabbi Yehuda machshir, Rabbi Yehuda posel. Why would he be posel a green etrog? Lav mishum debai hadar. Isn't it because he needs it to be beautiful and the green one is ugly? Lo mishum de lo gamar peri. No, because he thinks it's not fully ripe. That's why you need it to be a ripe fruit. It has to be a fruit that's ripe, not unripe. Tashma. What about this one? Shiur etrog katam. What's the smallest possible etrog? Rabbi Meir omer ke'ego is the size of a walnut, right? Imagine such a teeny one. Rabbi Yehuda omer ke'beitzah. It has to be the size of an egg. Why does he need to be the size of an egg? Lav mishum debai hadar, isn't it? Because he needs it to look beautiful. Lo mishum de lo gamar peri. Again, it's the same thing. It just didn't come to full growth. It's not ripe yet. Tashma, what about this one? Ubigadol kadesh yochaz shnayim biyado achat. Divrei Rabbi Meir. When it comes to how big, right? That was how small can it be? Minimum size. Maximum size is it can't be so big that you can't hold two in one hand. Rabbi Yossi omer afilu achad b'shtei yadav. Even a gigantic one that you need to hold it with both your hands is okay. So now, my time, why does he say it can't be so big? Lav mishum debai hadar. This is interesting. You might think those gigantic ones are more beautiful. No, they're saying it's too big. It's too all right. Gigantic. You ever see those Temani ones? Right. That's already ugly. Right? An etrog that's nice is a small one that fits into two hands. They assume, isn't it a din in hadal? And then they say, lo. It's not the case. The reason why he says you have to be able to hold two in one hand is da'ama, I assume it's Rava instead of Rabba. Yeah, da'ama Rava. Lulav biyamim ve'etrog b'smol. This we know, the lulav is to go on your right hand and the etrog goes on your left. Zimnin demachalfele ba'ati lafuchinu va'ati livsule. Sometimes someone might pass you the lulav and etrog, and they'll pass it to you in the opposite. Imagine also they're holding the lulav in the right and the lulav in the right and the etrog in the left, and they pass it to you. They're standing opposite you. You'll take, right, the etrog will be in your right hand, and you'll need to switch them. And if it's too big, what will happen? You might drop it on the floor, and it might get disqualified. If the pitam falls off, it gets ruined, or something else could happen to it, and it could get ruined. That's why, not because of hadar, but because if you get to a situation where you have to flip hands and it's too gigantic and you won't be able to, then you might accidentally drop it on the floor. So it's more of a technical issue. But Now comes the big question. But forget about all these Braita where Rabbi Yehuda says you need this, you need that. Okay, we can explain them all away. It's not because of Hadar. But what about the Pasuk? Pasuk says pre-eitz Hadar. We assume Hadar means beautiful. So he said, no, that's not what it means. That's to tell you which type of tree do we need it from? An etrog. Why? What's unique about an etrog? Most fruit trees bloom one time a year. This is a tree that produces fruits all year long. It's dar. Hadar doesn't mean hadar, beautiful. It means hadar, that dwells. It dwells on the tree all year long. I've heard from people, by the way, who have etrog trees, that they in fact do get etrogim all year long. They ripen all the time. Different ones are ripening all year long. So that's something unique about an etrog tree. And that's how etrog became the fruit. It's one of the reasons why etrog became the fruit that's used, one of the explanations. Okay, continuing on. Shel Asherah v'shel Ir Anidacha. We're back to the Mishnah now. We have an Asherah, a tree that was used for Asherah, and an Ir Anidachat, if it was a palm tree, that was an Eitz Asherah, or one that belonged to a city where all the inhabitants worship the Avodah Zarah and you have to burn everything in the city, they are no good for a lulav. V'shel Asherah pasul. V'hamarava. But wait, Rava says, lulav shel avodah zarah lo yitov v'im natal kasher. It says if you take a lulav that was worshipped for idol worship, you can't do that. But if you did it already, it's okay. So how do they explain this Asherah? Hacha ba'asherah de Moshe askina. We're talking about the Asherah that was in existence in the time of Moshe. And we're told about that kind of Asherah that when they got into the land, it says, Ashrehem tisrifum be'esh. They have to be burned. Because you have to burn it, that means if something is supposed to be burned, it means that even though it's in existence right now, it's as if it's not in existence. And that's what they say right here. It doesn't have any amount of anything because it's meant to be burnt. So it's as if it's nothing. And therefore, you can't, that's why you can't use it. And it's only the Asherah de Moshe, but not regular Avodah Zarah. Daikanami de Katani, and you can further prove it because it's written next to, again, this juxtaposition we keep learning from. Dumia de Ir Anidachat Shma Mina. It's like an Ir Anidacha, which also has to be burned. And as it's written right next to it, must be it has the same issue, which both of them need to be burned. Because they need to be burned, therefore, they don't have a minimum requisite amount of anything, and therefore you can't use them. Okay, Niktam Rosho. Amar Rav Huna, Lo Shanu Ela Niktam, Aval Nistak Kasher. So now he says it's only if it gets cut off. Okay, but if it ends up with a crack in it, I guess is what they mean here. 1 second. If it's nistak, right, if the whole thing falls off is what they say. But if it's nistak, if you end up with like cuts in the top of the top of the leaves, sounds like it's fine. And the Gemara is going to question that. It's going to question that in the next section, which we'll start with tomorrow. Have a great day, everyone.